So what we want to talk about now is how you make sure that not only the technology is sound, but also that you have your ducks in a row in alignment with your users so that they are excited about what they're going to be getting and not resistant to the change, because there is a lot of value in ensuring that OSI, that eighth layer of the OSI model, is addressed so that your investments you get the most out of your investments and have the most success with your project, and the user base that loves what you're giving them and is patient with you during the migration. So Taylor, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Will do. Yeah, and I appreciate the intro. And I often call this session, guys, kind of the bringing it all together, as it were, session. I know we've looked at a lot of things today, technically, fortunately or otherwise. We'll look at some of those things again here in this session, but we'll start to look at them through a different lens, as Chris references this mysterious layer 8. Because that's a large part of what I do here at Enabling, is work with customers around change management, and we find it's an ever increasingly important part of any proper migration strategy. So what we've tried to do in this session is break things down into 4 logical steps as far as preparing and executing your migration to Skype for Business. The first step, I would contend, is it's important that you actually take a step back and determine your desired feature set. Now, I realize there may be some head scratching going on. We know we're looking at Skype for Business. We logically know what that feature set is. But if we look at the 3 points here on this slide, I think the first thing that's imperative is that we understand in full the feature set that's available with the 3 primary architectures that are in hand for Skype for Business, whether that's an on-premises deployment, cloud with or without, cloud PBX, Skype for Business, or some sort of a hybrid configuration where you have one foot in both worlds. As you've hopefully learned a lot about today, there are unique feature sets afforded with each of those configurations, and without a rich understanding going in for each of those different configurations and what's in and what's out, there is some danger from a user as well as a technical perspective in setting course down the wrong path. The second point, and Chris alluded to this a little bit at the onset, is this concept of usage profiles, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through our session here today. I would contend this is one of the more important tasks associated, even though it's not a technical task, truly understanding how our users communicate in the environment. What you may find as you start to work through this exercise, and again, we'll give some pointers there, is that you may be looking at technologies that really aren't a great fit for certain profiles within your organization. Conversely, you may be looking to exclude certain technologies that would give you the most bang for your buck from a return on investment and user satisfaction perspective. So in addition to understanding the feature set afforded with whatever path you're choosing to take with your Skype for Business migration, it's imperative that you understand the usage profiles in your organization and how they're actually going to leverage these new technologies. The last task I would definitely advocate is always keep your long-term vision in mind. It's amazing how sometimes this gets lost. I think we can all be guilty of losing sight of the forest for the trees, but you may be leaning towards a Skype for Business on-premises deployment here at day 1, but know in the back of your mind that there is an initiative at your organization to quote-unquote get to the cloud. I think most of us at least have heard that in one way, shape, or form. If that's the case, make good decisions as far as which path you're going to take. There may be an opportunity here to look at certain usage profiles in your organization and start to dip a toe in that water. So talking about usage profile planning, little summary for you here on this slide. A usage profile is really just a similar group of users, right? They have similar needs in the way they communicate. And what you'll find is that they not only have similar ways they communicate, but they follow somewhat predictable patterns. And that doesn't just apply just to the way they communicate, but also what the technology requirements would be therein. What we have found, and we're not alone in this belief, there are other consulting firms out there that feel the same way. By and large, 90+% of the time, there are 8 usage profiles that account for our users in our organizations. Now, the actual job role, if you will, or perhaps the title associated with these folks may vary greatly from organization to organization. But within the concept of usage profiles, even though one may be tomato and one may be tomato, at the end of the day, they're communicating the same way and would be keenly interested in the same set of tools. What do we get out of this when we work through this exercise in usage profiles? Well, The first thing is we start to shift the conversation from what should we buy to what do we need. And in the spirit of organizational change management, that is a critical concept. Right. What we want to do is provide our users with the tools that they need to be more collaborative, productive, and happy. And by working through the usage profile exercise, we start to embark on that journey. Second bullet point, and I've alluded to this already, is we really can start to pinpoint where we're going to get the most proverbial bang for our buck. All right, where are we going to get the most return on investment? A simple example would be if we are looking at Skype for Business and we have a heavy usage profile of a very, very mobile workforce, it really doesn't behoove us to invest heavily in communicating and pushing and configuring features around sharing the desktop. Reason being is these folks aren't really in the business of sharing their desktop. What they would care more about is the Skype for Business mobile client, one click to join meetings, basically extensibility through SimulRing or call forwarding. And again, working through the usage profile planning makes those answers very, very apparent. The last part is you'll be able to figure out your highest return, lowest risk roadmap for the actual migration. And by this, we mean it's a combination of choosing the right feature set and technologies, up to and including devices for each of the user profiles in your organization. But you'll also start to identify certain key features that will be deployed in different orders by usage profile. You may also find your path forward as far as who goes first, assuming that you're going to have some sort of a gradual migration into Skype for Business. So what are these 8 mysterious usage profiles? We've listed them here on this slide, and of course we'll provide copies of these decks, so I won't bore everyone to tears by listing these off. But what you'll see as you work through this, as you might expect, there are some common characters here that I think most of us are aware of. The on-premises mobile collaboration group, right? Well, a lot of us on this call may very well fit into that group. We work on-prem, but there's a degree of mobile to what we do. We're going to be interested in both desktop and mobile features. And as you can see, as we work through these 8 profiles, they're really just 8 different ways of doing business within, again, 90+% of organizations out there. And you'll see to the right there's a pie chart that breaks down on industry average where most users fall within these usage profiles. It's interesting that roughly half of the workforce out there falls into some sort of a production usage profile, or usage profile 6, which is that on-premises mobile. I find in working with clients that again, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that typically half of the workforce falls within that one user group type, and efforts may not be appropriately divvied up, as it were. We may spend half of our time trying to train the admin group or get them excited when they, by and large, only represent 5% of the workforce. So having an understanding of how these play out in your organization is, of course, imperative, but understanding how that marries up to other things that we've seen in the industry also important. Below, and I'll apologize, you can only fit so much on any one PowerPoint slide, but this is a screenshot of just the beginning of working through this exercise. And what I've highlighted would be 2 verticals there, marketing and distribution, and across the top, common quote-unquote work roles within those organizations. What you'll see once you start to build out these tables is if you were to work through this exercise in your organization, you may find that you have all of these usage profiles. You may find that you only have 3 or 4 of these usage profiles. What's important is to start working through that exercise, and then, of course, where you see the color-coded boxes below there, that's where you would drop in the actual titles or roles in your organization, marry them up against these usage profiles, and start to create your blueprint for, again, a lot of things. Which features are in, which features are out. Who are going to be my early adopters or migrators, who aren't. But a very key concept, and candidly one that I think many of us on the call sometimes aren't familiar with, right? As Chris said, our fellow propeller heads. Don't get me wrong, I'm the same way. I came from the technical side of enabling technologies, was there for many years. And what we lose sight of sometimes is the rest of the users don't think the way we do. They don't always get excited about having all of these new technologies. Our goal is to understand how they do their jobs, appropriately configure the solutions, and excite the users by representing these as tools that are going to make their workday more efficient. So after we've worked through that first step, and this one does dovetail in a little bit, step number 2 is it's time to really get down to brass tacks and choose our optimal architecture. Now, I know that Jeff and Joshua both spent a fair amount of time here in the prior session, so we'll try and move quickly through this. But really, again, there are 3 options. First would be on-premises. Top of the slide there, you'll see some of the key points of on-premises, right? Well, obviously, all of our users would be on-prem. It does allow for the creation of paired pools, so we'd have the opportunity for disaster recovery continuity. It allows for relatively straightforward integration with other on-premises assets, like in some of the Q&A. In the prior session, there were questions around interoperability between Cisco and Skype for Business. On-premises, piece of cake. We've done that for years. Also gives you, I would contend, the most full-featured contact center offerings. So if contact center is a large part of your business, as it sits today, by and large, the on-premises deployment of Skype for Business is likely going to make the most sense. You can, however, still configure this, as it points out there on the 5th bullet point, in hybrid fashion with Skype for Business. At a minimum, that would allow you to take advantage of meeting broadcast. If you're not already familiar, it's the opportunity to broadcast a meeting to up to 10,000 attendees, as long as you have an Office 365 Skype for Business tenant. That would also get that proverbial toe in the water to where you might start experimenting with Cloud PBX for certain usage profiles in your environment. Down below, just some basic pros and cons to keep in mind with this particular configuration. Pros in my mind would be no dependency on internet connections, right? The cloud's a wonderful thing as long as we have internet connectivity. And there are a lot of things that can be done to make that as resilient as possible, but at the end of the day, the on-premises solution would be the one solution that would be not dependent on that internet connection for your voice. It gives you the full voice feature set, so none of the limitations that would exist today, although they're being knocked down quickly with Cloud PBX. Skype for Business on-premises, of course, is the native version of the product. It allows for easy third-party integrations, as noted, and lastly, it would allow for DR continuity through deployment of multiple pools. So what would be some of the cons? Why are more and more folks looking at the cloud? Well, we have to build a lot of servers in most cases if we're looking at doing an on-premises Skype for Business. So that leads to typically a heavy upfront capital investment. Also, the product does age, right? I mean, I've been around long enough to remember OCS and Link 2010 and Link 2013, so on and so forth up the stack. And each time one of those new products comes out, if an on-premises client wants to take advantage of that, it's some sort of a in-place upgrade today, or prior it was a build and migrate story. But there is this cyclical investment to stay on the most current version, whereas with Office 365, you're always on the most current version. Nice segue for myself. Let's talk about Office 365 and Skype for Business Online. What does that look like? Of course, all of our users are in the cloud. Very similar feature set. No persistent chat role, although we don't see a lot of clients take advantage of that role anyway with Skype for Business Online. And as we know, Cloud PBX does have a reduced feature set in comparison to on-premises, although, again, that gap is closing quickly. PSTN conferencing would absolutely be an option with Skype for Business Online, definitely stateside and in an ever-increasing list of countries. If you have any questions about that, we can post a link in the window where you can see where availability is globally for both PSTN conferencing as well as Cloud PBX. Lastly, it is a low-cost addition to Office 365. If you're already there, you're already there for your Exchange, maybe your SharePoint, some of these other technologies, whether you move to the full E5 Cal or whether you just look at the additive bump, as it were, for PSTN conferencing or perhaps Cloud PBX, it is quite low cost. So pros and cons of this model. Pros, lower cost model, of course, at least initially, than on-premises. We don't have that great big server build, right? It's just, again, if you're already in 365, a nominal bump to take advantage of these features. Very similar feature set to on-premises. It's an extremely nimble solution in that it requires little or no on-premises equipment other than user devices. Of course, that will depend on how you want to configure your SSO model. Cons, of course, dependent on an internet connection, although bandwidth is cheap, as they say these days, and that can be made quite resilient. It can create some network engineering challenges as well. It's great that we have bandwidth to the cloud, but you'll want to make sure that you run through appropriate exercises to make sure that that's quality bandwidth to guarantee that user experience. It does have a limited feature set with regard to voice and a more limited integration story, at least at this stage of the game, with third-party products such as Contact Center as listed here. The last option I would ask, is hybrid right for me? I find that this is actually a great solution for an ever-increasing number of customers, particularly if you already have an investment in on-premises environment. Very minimal work to get that set up with a Skype for Business Online tenant in a hybrid fashion. It gives you the ability to split your users between the two. Accounts can be located users with accounts in on-premises, they have that same server experience and capability, wherein they still have the ability to fully communicate with users that are in the Office 365 offering. An example of that may be perhaps you have a very robust contact center tied to your Skype for Business online environment today, and it doesn't have a great story today with Cloud PBX, but you have 300 or 400 users that are highly mobile, they're in the field, they really just want dial tone and a voicemail box. Makes great sense to set up a hybrid and shift those mobile users into the cloud. They'll still have that fully integrated experience with the folks on-prem, but the folks on-prem would still be leveraging that pool and the associated contact center. You do have in this option the capability to continue to maintain your PSTN connectivity. You could conceivably also look at different connectivity for the users in the cloud. The reason I put that in there, though, is one common roadblock that we'll see out there with folks that are excited to move to the cloud is you may be in a 2 or 3 or 4 or even more year agreement with your current PSTN provider and not really in a position to pay those termination fees. You would be in great shape with a hybrid solution because your users who are in the cloud would still be able to take advantage of those on-premises PSTN services. It gives you the opportunity to integrate with your legacy PBX on-premises if you still wish to with your Skype for Business on-prem pool, and then split domain for signaling and media paths. The reason this is important is once a call is established from a cloud PBX user, it's really just signaling that traverses that link and it goes peer-to-peer for the actual media of the call. Great technology in that it safeguards some of that bandwidth. Pros and cons of this model. Pros, it allows for a gradual migration. It allows for the full PSTN feature set via the on-premises server, as well as the inherent nimble benefits of a cloud solution with your users who've been moved up to the cloud. And it does allow, again, for the use of your existing PSTN trunks. As noted, it may be a contractual issue to cancel those. Cons would be that it requires build and support of an on-premises infrastructure. So I will be the first to admit, in the many, many hundreds of customers that I've talked to, almost always when we have this hybrid conversation, it's a client who already has some sort of an on-premises Skype for Business environment, and they're looking to expand that offering to the cloud. But that's not to say that if you're brand new to this world, hybrid may be a good fit. You may just have some fundamental reasons why you need certain users on-premises and other users in the cloud. Okay, so I tried to go pretty quickly through that, and hopefully that was helpful in that I don't want to waste anyone's time knowing that you've seen a lot of those things previously in our sessions today, but sometimes it's fun just to hear those from another person and their own perspective, and I enjoy the pros and cons. So once we've worked through our usage profile, we've really understood what it is that we're deploying, how our users are going to use this solution, and we've started putting on paper our fundamental plan for that aspect of the deployment. Number 2, we've decided on the architecture that we're going to embrace going forward. The third step is to actually work through the prerequisites and planning experience before you start the migration. Now, each of these 3 options will have different migration prerequisites, but I'm confident as we go through these next few slides here, you'll see an awful lot of similarities between all 3. So in the on-premises environment, what are some of the high-level prerequisite tasks that we need to be aware of and we need to work through? The first that I would always advocate is invest in proper planning and design with a proven Skype for Business partner. Now, it may be enabling, it may not be enabling. The important part here is to take advantage of, well, candidly, someone else's lessons learned. When you've done 12 or 1,400 Skype for Business and link deployments, you learn a few things. And that's not to say that everybody on this call is not capable of learning these things. Of course we are. But sometimes, in fact, I would say in most cases, it's a great exercise just to partner up someone who's already been down that road, learn where to expect the potholes, the hurdles, all of these things that come up. Make sure you work with a proven partner who can help you through the proper planning as well, whether it's network, servers, so on and so forth, just to make sure you're in ideal shape before you start the migration. Without exception, this is also a great time to look at your Active Directory. Not everybody is going to need to actually perform the Active Directory cleanup, but of course with Skype for Business being as tightly integrated as it is with AD, this is the time. If any of us on this call are like myself and sometimes procrastinate, and we've known for 18 months that we need to get in there and clean up Active Directory, make sure that that gets done before we trudge forward with Skype for Business. Make sure that you're conducting those thorough usage profile analysis exercises. You really want to make sure that you're figuring out the optimal feature sets, devices, rollout plans, so on and so forth for each of those profiles in your organization. A fourth and very important one is plan for mobile devices. And this, I would contend, goes over and above Skype for Business. Understand what your strategy is going to be, whether it's BYOD or not BYOD. Understand what you're going to do from an MDM perspective. And lastly, and in my mind most importantly, understand how Skype for Business in any of these three different configurations is going to behave on the mobile device. One of the greatest benefits, of course, of Skype for Business is the inherent mobility. And users absolutely will want to take advantage of the mobile aspect of Skype for Business. So putting our head in the sand and pretending like the mobile aspect of Skype will be a toy, or perhaps the users will just figure it out. These are very much red flags. Understand your users, understand your organization, understand how they're going to use mobility with Skype for Business. Of course, since we're in an on-premises model here, you'll need to plan for the build of your required servers. Again, they can all be physical, they can all be virtual, they can actually be a mix of physical and virtual servers depending on the resources that you have. Word to the wise, and you'll hear anyone from Enabling as well as really any other partner tell you this till you're tired of hearing it. Don't under-spec the servers. Make sure that you, to the best of your abilities, you follow Microsoft's published standards as far as CPUs, memory, all of these things, or you do run the risk of reduced performance for the users. Make sure you understand as well the required DNS records and firewall ports that Skype for Business is going to require to function properly. And I would add a little bit of a real world to this too. Make sure you understand who the responsible party is in your organization for required DNS records and firewall ports. As a project manager for many years, I had many projects that would occasionally stall for 3, 5, 10 days, depending on who that person was, whether it was someone in the security team, or whether maybe we just didn't have the right understanding of change management. But before you actually start the migration, make sure that you've identified who these folks are and that they're on board with what these firewall port and DNS record requirements are going to be. You see on the next one, I have it in all bold. I obviously can't stress this one enough, but make sure that you're conducting rigorous network assessments and that you're modeling those around your planned Skype for Business traffic payloads. It doesn't do any of us any good to do a very simple voice assessment where we simulate 6 calls across 2 offices when we know darn good and well we're going to have 40 simultaneous calls, and they're also going to be doing a lot of desktop sharing and video. Make sure that you're not just doing this as an exercise. Get your hands dirty, I often say when conducting these network assessments. Skype for Business does touch every single layer in the OSI model, and Skype for Business is somewhat irksome, candidly, sometimes in its innate ability to uncover things in your network that you may not even have known were issues. It's just an incredibly robust product, and the way that you can make sure that this experience is a great one right out of the is to invest and conduct these rigorous network assessments to make sure that we're not going to have to make any modifications prior to deployment. Also make sure that you're planning for procurement of required hardware. Right, so depending on your particular configuration and on-premises Skype for Business model, you may need to buy hardware load balancers, you may need new or refreshed session border controllers, so on, so forth, but make sure that that's factored into your budget and into your project plan as prerequisite steps. When we look at Skype for Business Online, and I may be able to move a little bit quicker through this slide because you will see a lot of these are the same. First, again, make sure that you invest with that proven partner as far as planning and design. I can't stress that enough. It's just such a great investment to make sure that you set sail on the right course. As with the on-premises model, we're still going to want to make sure that our Active Directory is in great shape. In fact, we may even have a little bit more need for this too, depending on how we're looking at our single sign-on model, given the fact that we're going to replicate this user data up into Azure AD, most likely for SSO when we're in the cloud. We're going to want to make sure that AD is as pristine as possible so as to avoid any bumps in the road once we start migrating that user authentication data. Well, a nice segue to my next bullet point. Make sure that you've devised and implemented an appropriate SSO strategy. I'm not going to sidetrack our Skype for Business call here talking about all the different ways that we can handle user identity management, but make sure that you're having that conversation with the right partner and investing appropriately based on what you're trying to do. The configuration is going to vary wildly between someone who just really wants the users to be able to sign on with their same network credentials with Skype for Business Online, or someone who wants to implement a comprehensive, perhaps documents right management policy that looks at things both in the cloud and on premises. It's just going to shift. Make sure that you're not figuring that out when you're already 2 weeks into your Skype for Business Online deployment. This is something you'll want to have nailed down before you begin. As with Skype for Business on premises, again, make sure that you're planning and accounting for mobile devices, and in particular, the way users will use those. Conduct those usage profile analysis exercises again. Understand the Skype for Business online feature set that you're deploying. Marry that up against your usage profiles, and your communications and rollout plans will start to take shape. You will still likely need to plan for the building of required servers. Now, these may just be some Azure server instances for single sign-on, but don't forget that you're going to have some sort of a quote-unquote server build story to account for, at a minimum, SSO once you look at Skype for Business Online. Similarly, make sure that we're making the right choices as far as our DNS records and firewall ports. Now, this may be a reduced set, of course, versus on-premises, because a lot of these services are now living off of our network, as it were, in Office 365, but still some good research and some good conversation to have with your security folks. There it is again, all in bold, but just like we would for an on-premises deployment, we need to make sure that we're conducting those rigorous network assessments. Now, oftentimes these are different tools. Perhaps this is a little bit more modeling than it is actual assessments, because, of course, it's very difficult to deploy network assessment hardware in Microsoft's data center. But there are tools that are out there to help you be successful as far as planning these Skype for Business payloads on your network and making sure that you're properly configured. The last thing that you should take into account when you're planning your Skype for Business Online prereqs is whether voice or PSTN conferencing is planned. And if that is in the cards, make sure that before you start the engagement, you've identified what you're going to use for those services. Most likely it's going to be Microsoft services. They're relatively easy to provision directly from the portal. But don't let this be one of those things where we're 3 days prior to rollout of PSTN conferencing. You've been communicating with the users, they're super jazzed and can't wait to use it, and whoops, nobody provisioned a circuit. With the ID numbers for conferencing, make sure that you're out in front of that one. With regard to hybrid prereqs, I'm just going to kind of talk as I click. This really becomes a combination of what we saw for on-premises and Skype for Business Online, because effectively you're building both, right? And then lastly, configuring that leg or that arm between the on-premises and the Skype for Business Online world. So you will still need to figure out your Active Directory, your SSO strategy, your usage profile, but you'll still have to plan for building of arguably more servers now, because you'll have some degree of SSO coupled with your on-premises Skype for Business environment. You will have those DNS records to plan for. You'll need to conduct those rigorous network assessments both for the online experience as well as the on-premises experience. And lastly, you'll need to figure out your PSTN. Now, what's different in this case is you also have to figure out whether that'll be provided from on-premises or from in the cloud or from a combination of both. So a little bit more complexity to the hybrid. Last point I would make here in the hybrid model is make sure you clearly define going in who you at least anticipate is going to be in the cloud and who is going to be on premises, and be able to articulate why. All right, nobody likes to be a user who just gets put up in the cloud because, well, we wanted to put some users up in the cloud. Again, going back to the usage profiles, if you've conducted that exercise, you should be completely locked in on which usage profiles are a good fit for cloud technologies versus on-premises, or vice versa, and build your plan around that. The other, on top of planning, the other aspect of preparing for the migration is discovery. So the key facets of discovery, and by discovery we mean just making sure that we're measuring twice and only cutting once. We should work through a series of questions, or again, just discovery points to figure out how our Skype for Business world is going to tie in. The first thing that we would want to look at, of course, kind of a no-brainer, is what voice and PBX technologies do we currently have in use. The reason that's important is it will springboard you into a larger conversation around integration points, right? Are we in a gradual migration, moving people from a Cisco Call Manager, for example, to Skype for Business? Or are we going to keep these 100 people over here on our Avaya PBX because we want to deprecate our investment in that contact center, but these 700 people are going to be on Skype for Business? Understanding the technologies in place will help you identify whether they're SIP capable for integration. If not, what do we need to do as far as looking at perhaps T1 interface availability? Also, what are we going to do for voicemail, right? I mean, obviously for Skype for Business, we're going to have unified messaging, but do we want to take a look at that as a voicemail solution for some of our PBX users? As you might guess, this can get to be a relatively complicated conversation pretty quickly. It's tenfold more complicated, though, if you start the migration and then try and work backwards and figure out what this voice integration story looks like. So make sure you're performing this discovery as part of your pre-migration experience. Next section, there's understand your existing voicemail. Right? Take a look at what you have. If you're moving to Skype voice, of course, this would only be applicable. Figure out how many ports you're actually using for voicemail. That will determine how many unified messaging servers you're going to need if you're looking at on-premises for your exchange. Really get in and understand your auto attendants. And I mean, not to trade war stories, but I can tell you that in probably 90%, if not more, of the engagements that I managed as a project manager here at Enabling, this was an uphill battle, right? And these things have a way of growing. They're kind of like a ivy vine on the side of the building. The trees are always getting deeper in the auto attendants. New greetings, new paths are always being added, and oftentimes there are multiple parties within an organization that have those administrative rights. So I've seen a lot of blank stares when I've asked for a map of what the auto attendants look like. It's imperative that we know those, though, so that when we start to move to Skype Voice, we can build out a very similar functionality in unified messaging. You may be lucky. There may be someone who can sit right down and knock all of those out for you on a single sheet of paper. On the other hand, it may be an experience where you actually have to call in to all of your auto attendants and figure out where they go. But being able to clearly delineate those before you start the migration will save you a ton of time once you're farther down the path as far as configuring unified messaging. Certainly understand the distribution lists that would be associated with your voicemail. Also, voicemail boxes for non-email accounts. Exchange unified messaging, of course, would probably pretty self-explanatory. It requires an Exchange mailbox to get voicemail. Odds are you probably have some voicemail boxes out there in your organization that don't have email accounts. Make sure that you're building and accounting for those going forward with Skype Voice in your Exchange unified messaging plan. I promised I couldn't say this enough. Apparently I really can't, but make sure you understand the importance of network readiness assessments. Make sure that not only are you being rigorous in these, but as I call out in the third bullet point there, be prepared to take action. That's another, I'm not going to say common miss, but let's say not uncommon miss that I've seen in Skype for Business deployments is we clearly identify problematic links. And sometimes it's kind of an exercise, and let's just push on anyway and see what happens. And as you might expect, that story doesn't always end so well. If we uncover things in the network that require remediation, don't put your head in the sand. Make sure that you get that taken care of before you start that aspect of the deployment. Fourth point there is make sure, too, that you understand what you're doing for video conferencing in the environment. This may be an opportunity where you're looking to refresh. If so, that's great. It makes perfect sense. There are a huge variety of fantastic video conferencing tools that are interoperable with Skype for Business. Odds are, though, at least in some degree, there's going to be an expectation that you try and leverage existing video equipment. So perform your due diligence there. Make sure you understand the make and model of room and desktop systems that are present. Understand what protocols they support. Reason being is Skype for Business is not natively interoperable with every video system that's out there. Which leads to the third bullet point. Understand what you have already in hand as far as bridges, MCUs, that sort of thing to bring together disparate video conferencing systems, or perhaps explore new solutions that are out there so that your Skype for Business experience video-wise can integrate directly with the legacy video equipment that you have on premises. Make sure as well that you review your existing infrastructure and applications. Excuse me, whoever your partner is in this journey with Skype for Business, they should be providing you with a robust list of prerequisites that would talk to you what's required as far as your versioning and configurations of AD, DNS, DHCP, so on and so forth. Make sure that those are up to snuff. Domain functional level rarely comes up as an issue, but occasionally it can, so make sure that you're at an appropriate functional level on the domain. Understand your server naming convention. What you're going to want to do, of course, there is make sure that your Skype for Business servers follow that same convention for your corporate policy. Same with the domain. The second to the last one there talks to the reverse proxy. Again, we're in the on-premises model now. You're going to need that reverse proxy for external authentication, right? That's how people will connect to join your meetings. That's how your mobile users will authenticate to take advantage of Skype for Business. Understand what you have in place. You may have something that's perfectly appropriate, or you may need to put something new in place. Review as well, again, the output of Active Directory. There are some very basic tools. I think we're all familiar with NetDiag and DCDiag. Make sure that you're running those tools to make sure that Active Directory is, in fact, healthy. Make sure it's replicating the way you would expect. And again, take this as an opportunity to do that housekeeping in Active Directory that some of us may have put off for longer than we should. Last point there is understand where you're at as far as PKI. Skype for Business is a exceedingly certificate-hungry configuration. If you haven't already gotten familiar with it, a lot of these servers can be generated. A lot of these servers certificates can be generated from your internal PKI. It's perfectly fine as well to use public certs for the servers as well. But understand what that certificate experience is going to look like. Almost every Skype for Business deployment is going to be a mixture of some internal certs via the PKI, some external certs through a trusted certificate provider. Just don't be surprised by this. Understand going in what the certificate needs are going to be for Skype for Business. As you can see, there's a lot to discover, folks, but I promise we're almost getting to the end. The other thing that, of course, you're going to want to take a look at is not just the bandwidth and throughput experience, but actually take a look at your infrastructure. You may find that you have some aged equipment out there, right? Switches that don't support consistent DHCP tagging. You can't put QoS on all facets of the network. Wi-Fi would certainly come into the mix here. Do we have appropriate coverage? Because I promise you, once these users start getting Skype for Business voice on their mobile device, they're going to be roaming the building, making Wi-Fi calls with Skype for Business, so make sure we don't have dead spots. But this is more of a kind of layer 2, if you will. Make sure that the actual backbone, network-wise, is up to snuff to support these newer technologies. And then lastly, don't forget the actual operational side, right? Sometimes we get so excited when we're planning out these deployments that we really don't figure out who's on first as far as support, triaging issues, day-to-day adds, moves, changes, configuration, until we get done with the deployment. Then it's kind of a draw straws type exercise. Have this conversation early. Make this part of your pre-migration planning. When poor discovery happens, kind of a fancy slide, some things flying around there, there are literally 1,000 things that can go wrong. The idea with discovery is to try and uncover any of these gremlins that we can. But as you can see here, some of the common things that we have seen that will surprise if proper discovery is not done. Like, I mean, I would ask for a show of hands, but I know it wouldn't be many. How many of us on this call that are planning a Skype for Business deployment have actually stopped and thought about the cabling in our building, right? Probably not very many of us. Same with legacy switching and routing hardware. We probably assume it's fine. I watched an engineer burn 2.5 days one time trying to figure out why Skype was having so much trouble with voice, and come to find out it was because a user had brought a hub in from Best Buy and stuck it under their desk because they wanted more network ports, and it was broadcasting on that entire VLAN segment and just wreaking havoc. These are the little fun things, right, that can make a Skype for Business deployment very pleasant if we uncover them up front through proper discovery, or very painful if we hedge on discovery and we hope for the best and then we have to work backwards and figure them out down the road. Key final things to consider when planning is understand, again, the server requirements. With an on-premises Skype for Business, there's going to be a lot of servers. Don't underspec these servers, or quite likely you'll pay the price from a performance perspective. And there are different things about each server to keep in mind. I mean, certainly there's the cores, the memory, that sort of thing. But excuse me, there will be certain servers that live at your DMZ. They're not domain joined. They have 2 non-routable NIC interfaces, one foot in the outside world, one in the in. So there can be a lot of idiosyncrasies just to work through in your planning exercise to make sure you're ready to lock and load effectively once it comes time for the migration. Make sure you have that conversation again about the integration points between your new Skype for Business deployment and legacy technology. All right, are we going to require gateways? How is call flow going to work if we have some users on Skype for Business and some users on Cisco? What sort of third-party products are out there that users are going to want to keep using? It may be a call center. It may be a fax server. There may be a paging integration. Understand what those integration points are, though, so that you have that documented before you start the migration. Lastly, and the underlying part's the most important one here, is understand your change management policies. I find that with Skype for Business deployments, sometimes folks don't understand their change management policies as well as they might think they do. So get out in front of that. have those conversations around the security considerations, whether it's the DNS, the certs, the firewall ports. Make sure you understand your QoS strategy. Make sure you understand if you have outage windows, in your environment, when those are, and what sort of lead time you need to put forth to get into that window. Don't let this be a bottleneck for you throughout your project. And as you might expect, something that we've seen happen more than a few times, where we get heads down into a deployment and all of a sudden find out that we sometimes have to take days off, and it starts to really slow down the deployment cycle, which is no good for anyone. Just over change management. So make sure you understand those policies and plan accordingly. We've talked a little bit about the core environmental considerations, the LAN, the WAN, the certs, right? Those sorts of things, understand that. Again, can't say it enough, the bandwidth planning. Make sure that you're doing a good job of assessing that traffic, and again, model it after Skype for Business. Lastly, if you do find hotspots, make sure you're fixing those. And then finally, what is our plan for migration? And some of this will dovetail into what we talk about here in the next section around proper change management, but have a plan, right? Don't just get your Skype for Business in the cloud or hybrid or on-premises, whatever it is, in great shape and think it's good and turn it up for the IT department, let them bang on it for a week or two and say, hey, we're ready for our general release. That's not a plan, right? That's not a strategy. Go back to your usage profile discussions. Remember what you found out as far as early adopters, later adopters, feature sets, that sort of thing. Craft and adhere to an actual migration plan. It'll reduce your stress by 90% and make things that much more pleasant for the users as well. With 365, just a few additional things to keep in mind. Again, this is Skype for Business Online. We've talked about the importance of understanding what the single sign-on or same sign-on experience is going to be. Have the conversation around whether Azure is in play here. I find that in most cases it's a great place, if nothing else, to put those SSO servers and then start to explore Azure a little bit further, but make sure that you're having that conversation. Also go back and revisit this concept of hybrid, right? Figure out who's on first, who's going to be on-prem, who's going to be in the cloud. If we are doing a hybrid, what are some of the specific DNS or cert needs that we need to take advantage of? What's our migration process look like, right? Are we going to stay in a hybrid forever? Or is the plan that, we're going to stay in a hybrid for the first 90 days and then we're going to start moving users up? I've seen a lot of deployments in my life that were a permanent migration, right? Meaning that the migration was started and then that's where it stayed for years on end. Don't fall into that trap. Make sure that you have a good story in a hybrid of exactly where you want to land and when that's going to be. And then lastly, with 365, you do have some different things to think about. Right now, it's not just the internal network, those Wi-Fi hotspots, that legacy equipment, the cabling, all of those sorts of things. But we need to figure out what that's going to look like since we're bringing in the cloud as well. For example, are we a hub and spoke technology, right? And a lot of organizations are. You may have 55 remote offices, but they all have to come back to the mothership before they go out to the internet. Well, guess what that looks like if all of those offices are coming back to the hub and then up to 365, right? You get some serious congestion. So these are definitely conversations that you want to have before you embark with the 365 Skype for Business online story. All right, so hopefully that section was helpful. And just to recap, we've worked through the usage profiles and truly identified what we're deploying. We've figured out our reference architecture path that we're going to follow. We've worked through rigorous prerequisites to be prepared. It really becomes time to migrate. Now, I want everybody to stop and take a breath, because we would be very excited in our old lives at this point to start throwing up servers, slapping in SBCs, provisioning trunks, and getting this show on the road. I would contend that this is the point where we need to have meaningful conversation around our OCM, or organizational change management strategy. Far too often I have this conversation with clients maybe a week or two prior to the pilot starting, which effectively erases any runway that we could have had to craft our message, to make communications meaningful, to build a good communications thread with users, to get them excited. So again, as part of your planning of your migration strategy, make sure that you're at least incorporating a few of the basic change management strategies that we have here. First off, before you start this deployment, make sure that you're having a thorough organizational change management planning and discovery session. Many of you on the call have likely gone through technical planning and discovery sessions. In fact, I would contend probably all of us have done that before implementing a new technology. how many of us have ever done the same thing, but with what I call the softer side of IT, which would be our users? Key questions that we would want to ask during these sessions would be, what specifically are we rolling out to the users? Again, going back to that usage profiles conversation. Ask yourself as well, what are your strategic objectives, right? Because change management is more than just happy users. It's about shaping user behavior in a positive way to support strategic objectives. I'll give you an example. If dial-in conferencing is one of our strategic return on investment objectives for the Skype for Business deployment, we need to incorporate that early and often into our OCM strategy to make sure that we're properly training and educating the users on those expectations. That's when we'll truly see that return on investment. Ask yourself also, in past initiatives, where have you failed users? And be honest, right? No one on this call, I would contend, can look me in the eye and honestly say that every deployment we've ever done has been a smashing success. Never had an angry user, never had someone say they needed more training, never had a pocket of users say they weren't communicated with. I mean, that's just not the reality. Make sure that you're going back, and maybe it's painful to relive some of those experiences, but have those conversations, because this is your opportunity to remediate those behaviors going forward. Again, have the conversation around definition of your user group types. Same thing as usage profiles in the organization. Because what you'll find with the proper OCM strategy is, whether it's training or user communications about the pending change, you're going to want to tailor these communications, no pun intended, toward each of those usage profiles in your organization. I'll go back to that example I used about why really try and highlight the desktop sharing aspect to a highly mobile user. It's a great feature. There's no harm in telling them about it, but that wouldn't be first in a user communication in my mind. Instead, the Skype for Business mobile client would be, right? Or SimulRing, these sorts of things. But without truly sitting down and defining these usage profiles and user group types, we're at a disadvantage to try and craft those meaningful user communications. Make sure you talk, too, about how your communications approach works. Most of us probably use email, right? I mean, that's the easiest way to do it. We send emails out to the users. We let them know that training's next Tuesday. Sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. Challenge that. Look at things like digital signage, printed flyers. Consider an email tracking system where you can actually see who opens and doesn't open communications. And make communications fun. Make them themed. Make them branded. Make it not just the black and white nuts and bolts IT communication that users, fortunately or not, have somewhat become used to. Ask yourselves how well training works in the organization as well. Sit down and look at your last handful of initiatives and actually put on paper what was done for training. And then in the column to the right of that, jot down your thoughts about the success. Some of the ways you would track success, of course, would be informal feedback from users. Maybe you're using surveys today, maybe you're not. But also look at your help desk tickets, right? If you went to Office 365 for Exchange Online and the phones were blowing up at the help desk, the training approach probably didn't work for that initiative. Also ask yourselves how you pilot. All right? A true pilot, as mentioned earlier, is not just IT department user acceptance testing. It should be a representative cross-sampling of the organization so that we can actually expose these people to our planned communications, to our planned training approach. Then let them have the solution after they've been through all of those things for a couple of weeks, and then we survey them heavily so that we can get their feedback on our direction. Right? Why not use our pilot group to course correct if we need to with regard to change management before we roll this out to all of the users? Also, take advantage of user satisfaction surveys. Now, everybody's a little bit sheepish about this. None of us want to choke that golden goose and over-survey users. But by keeping things brief and tactical and communicating clearly, as well as sort of a rotating cycle of surveys, right? Don't survey the same people every month. Break it up a little bit. This is gold. I mean, this is incredible information that we can get from users to make sure that the solution is hitting on all cylinders. And then lastly, make sure that you have a plan for after the rollout. Far too often we deploy one project only to race off to the next, right? All of us need more hours in the day. Make sure that you do have tools in place, though, even if they are somewhat minimal, to continue to touch the users, to look for opportunities for additional training, to try and identify any weak spots with regards to adoption so that you can truly maximize your return on investment. Some of the key OCM tools that you're going to want to develop to help the users. Excuse me. And again, I would contend that these should be part of your pre-deployment migration planning. You're going to want to develop a strategic and focused, what's in it for me based user communications plan. You're also going to want to create meaningful user communications templates. Again, we're huge fans of themes. Some of you may have heard of our lights, camera, adoption themed communications for users. They're all done in these various templates around the spirit of, hey, we're not rolling out Skype for Business, we're making a blockbuster production. And it's kind of silly, but it's a lot of fun, and it resonates with users and cuts through that inbox noise. So make the user communications, again, meaningful and fun. Not to beat that proverbial dead horse to death, but make sure that you have a proper pilot group in place. It should be structured, it should be strategic, it should be a representative cross-sampling, and you should really use that to your strategic advantage to get that feedback from those pilot group users before you go into production. Which leads to the fourth one there, figure out what your strategy is for user satisfaction surveys. Because if you're not using those today, you're really just telling the users we don't care about your feedback. Make sure that you'll see I've pointed out NSAT focus. That's a Microsoft standard scoring system. You really could use whatever you want, but make these trackable and measurable, right? You use something that's a sliding scale with a defined positive and negative end. Don't make these a subjective finger in the wind. Yeah, we looked at our survey results and users seemed kind of happy. Make sure you have an actual scoring system so that you can hold the OCM plan accountable and make course corrections as necessary. I talked to this in a little bit earlier, but make sure that not only have you defined your pilot group, but you've actually incorporated that into the plan. This is just a dummy project timeline, but you'll see along the bottom the common components, right? We start with our planning and design session. We move into the technical deployment. We get to the end there, and it's kind of time for testing and remediation. That's where the IT group's doing their UAT testing. We perform our final technical remediation, and we're kind of ready for launch. What you'll see, though, across the top there are all of the associated change management activities that need to be happening in sync, right? So you'll see where we have our welcome letter going out there. It's kind of the top left side. What is that? A month and a half prior to the final technical remediation. We start distributing those weekly or biweekly communications. We work them through training. Then we move them into the pilot. And all too often what we see out there is, hey, the pilot's starting next Wednesday, it's Friday, we probably better get an email out to them and let them know it's coming. And really, don't think of this as additive work, everyone. Think of this as an opportunity to make sure we're getting it right. This truly is where you're going to get the most return on your investment with this organizational change management perspectives. What good does it do for us to deploy these technologies if users aren't using them properly? The only way we can know if our approach is on the mark is to truly leverage our pilot group. So very, very important facet of a proper change management strategy. You're also going to want to define a robust training plan, right? It's not a one-size-all-fits story. You're going to want to have some classroom sessions. You're going to want to incorporate remote webinars. You may want to have some brown bags, right? Bring in a pizza, have some lunch and learn sessions. You're quite likely going to need some white glove for the executives, or arguably even more importantly, executive assistants in the organization, just because they have unique workflows. Don't forget device training, right? If this is a Skype for Business voice store, you're going to want to have structured sessions around the headsets or handsets that you're planning. And don't discount the importance of self-paced learning. Just as mentioned at the onset of the call, I spend the vast majority of my life these days working in this change management realm. This is an area that I've seen just go completely nuts this year as far as organizations looking to deploy some sort of a self-paced learning tool. Now, that may be an internal SharePoint page that the users are familiar with. Maybe it's on the intranet. You may look at third-party tools, like Enabling has a hosted training portal that users go to their own branded landing page. We create tracks, that sort of thing. But if you can shape that user behavior to take advantage of that as additive to the classrooms, the webinars, this sorts of things, a tremendous return on that investment, because these sorts of solutions are oftentimes quite low cost, and you're effectively empowering the users. The key with a training plan is it's the ABCs of learning, things that we probably all learned years ago in Psych 101. Everybody learns differently. Some people have to read it. Some people need to touch it and play with it. Some people love a classroom training. Me personally, I would hate to go to a classroom training. Give it to me in a webinar. Different strokes. And your user base is just like that, different strokes. So make sure that your training plan accounts for all of these and has appropriate learning vehicles for a wide variety of different users. Lastly, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, make sure that you have a plan for post-rollout. We call this syndication. In the movie industry, this is where movie companies actually make their money. They by and large, 100% of the time lose money at the box office. That's just a calculated risk. Yet the return on investment, if it becomes a syndicated production, is 90%. So yes, that's where all the money is. Same thing applies to organizational change management. That's great that we worked through usage profiles and nailed it. That's awesome that we made a robust communications plan and got the users excited. It's fantastic that we got them through training, and we're 1 week in and everybody's super excited about Skype for Business. What happens, though, if we don't continue to give that organizational management care and feeding is the solution starts to die on the vine, or we don't get full, what we would call, consumption of the technology because users don't continue to take advantage of increasingly more complex technologies. Right? Users may be fine day one with instant messaging and presence, and they can pick up their phone and they can make a phone call. We want them to the point where they're using video regularly. We want to see them use SimulRing so they never miss a call. We want to see them truly host effective collaborative meetings and reduce travel expenses. That's consumption. And the way we get there is with this ongoing change management. First thing that we want to do is make sure we continue surveying users. Again, we don't want to run the risk of over-surveying. Consider a round-robin schedule. Keep these surveys as brief as humanly possible while strategically targeted. Make sure that you continue to maintain some degree of success criteria matrices, right? Continue to challenge yourself, to continue to set benchmarks for adoption rates that you can track and say, yes, we are at 80% use of conferencing, or no, we're not, and then figure out why and develop OCM strategies to accommodate. Make sure that you continue to provide training too, right? At a minimum, there will be turnover, and there will be new hires that need to be exposed to these technologies. But what you'll find is a lot of users will continue to need just this opportunity to keep coming back to the well until that light bulb goes on. It can be a very overwhelming technology to start with, and you may see some limited feature set usage to start with. Having a plan with ongoing training is going to take it to the next level and really drive that true consumption. Make sure, too, that you have tools to measure adoption metrics. Right? I often say that success is not success unless it's measurable. So don't just say we're going to have great use of Skype for Business conferencing. Say, hey, we've deployed this tool, or we're going to look at the monitoring service or whatever it is, and we want to be at 86% usage by December 1st. And on December 1st, if you're at 90%, you can say you're a rock star. If you're at 50%, you can say, hey, we still have work to do, but make it measurable. And lastly, don't ever call it done. Right? These don't have to be incredibly time-consuming tasks, but they should be a regular part of day-to-day or week-to-week, month-to-month type activities. Make sure that you're continuing to apply that care and feeding from a change management perspective so that you can truly maximize your investment. So last slide for me here, and then we have a couple minutes for Q&A. Just a recap of what we've talked about today as far as this final kind of putting it all together before we start the migration session. Make sure, first of all, that you define that desired feature set and rollout plan based on business goals and usage profiles. Building from that work, determine the best architecture, Skype for Business, moving forward. Once you've defined that architecture, make sure that you carefully complete the associated prerequisites and discovery in preparation for the migration. And lastly, before we flip the switch and start putting these servers in place, make sure that you craft a winning change management strategy that engages the users before, during, and of course, ever importantly, after the migration. So with that, so we've only got a couple of minutes, but happy to field any questions that the group may have.
Looks like everybody gets it. Thank you, Taylor.
My pleasure.
All right.